The fluorescent lights of the boardroom flickered at 11:47 p.m. when Colleen Pratt's body hit the floor. Her designer blazer couldn't hide the bruises crawling up her arms. Purple, yellow, fresh, and old. The executives froze, their phones halfway to their ears, watching their CEO convulse on the cold marble. But it was Hank Carver who moved first, the night security guard, single father of a 7-year-old girl waiting at home. His hands were enormous, calloused, rough from years of work that seemed to have nothing to do with opening doors. Yet those same hands touched her with a precision that made the room fall silent. Movements too deliberate, too practiced. When Colleen's eyes fluttered open, she looked up at the stranger kneeling beside her. Hank's huge hands pulled back before she could speak. Something flickered across his face, not concern, something darker, something that looked almost like fear. No one in that room knew why a security guard's hands trembled at the sight of a woman he had just saved. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 5:15 in the morning when Hank Carver eased open the door to his daughter's bedroom. Rosie lay curled beneath a faded quilt, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of dreamless sleep. On the wall above her bed hung a photograph in a wooden frame, edges worn soft from years of small fingers, tracing the face of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. Mary Ann, his wife, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. Hank stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his daughter sleep, watching the photograph watch him back. 5 years. 5 years since he had held Mary Ann's hand in his and felt it go cold. 5 years since the machines had screamed and his world had collapsed into silence. He moved through the small apartment with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to live in shadows. The kitchen was modest, but clean, countertops wiped down, a single pot resting on the stove. Hank opened the refrigerator and began preparing breakfast, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness as he cracked eggs into a bowl. This was his routine. Wake before Rosie, cook her breakfast, pack her lunch, walk her to the bus stop, then sleep for a few hours before his shift at Preston Tower began. It was not the life he had imagined for himself. It was not the life Mary Ann had imagined for him. But it was the life he had chosen. And he had learned to find peace in its small mercies. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the eggs finished cooking, her hair a tangled mess, her pajamas decorated with cartoon elephants. She rubbed her eyes and yawned, then spotted her father at the stove and smiled. That smile. It was Mary Ann's smile, the same curve of the lips, the same light in the eyes. Every time Hank saw it, something cracked open inside his chest. He set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her and poured a glass of orange juice. Rosie ate in contented silence while Hank sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He did not eat breakfast himself. He had not had much of an appetite for 5 years. The bus stop was 3 blocks from their apartment, past the laundromat with the broken sign and the corner store where old Mr. Patterson sold newspapers and penny candy. Hank walked Rosie to school every morning, her small hand clasped in his enormous one. She chattered about her dreams, about her teacher, about a boy named Freddie who had shared his crayons with her. Hank listened and nodded and asked questions in all the right places. When the yellow bus rounded the corner, Rosie stood on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. He watched her climb aboard, watched the bus pull away, watched until it disappeared around the corner. Then he turned and walked back to the apartment, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the cracked sidewalk beneath his feet. The photograph of Mary Ann hung in 3 places in the apartment, one in Rosie's bedroom, positioned so it was the last thing the little girl saw before sleep and the first thing she saw upon waking. One in the living room on a shelf beside Rosie's baby pictures and a vase of dried flowers from Mary Ann's funeral. One in Hank's wallet, folded and creased from years of being carried close to his heart. He did not look at them often. Looking at them meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling the weight of everything he had lost. But sometimes, late at night, when Rosie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he would take out the photograph from his wallet and trace the outline of Marianne's face with his finger. She had been beautiful. She had been brilliant. She had been the best neurologist he had ever known, and he had been the surgeon who operated on her when the tumor in her brain had begun to grow. Hank showered and changed into his uniform, the dark blue fabric of his security guard outfit hanging loose on his frame. He had lost weight in the years since Marianne's death. The muscles he had built during his residency, the broad shoulders and strong arms of a surgeon who spent hours standing over operating tables, had softened into something less defined. But his hands remained the same. Large, powerful, steady. Those hands had once held scalpels with the precision of an artist. Now they held flashlights and walkie-talkies, opening doors for executives who never looked him in the eye. Preston Tower rose 40 stories into the evening sky, its glass facade reflecting the dying light of the sun. Hank arrived at 6 o'clock, signed in at the front desk, and began his rounds. The building housed Pratt Technologies, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. Its founder and CEO, Colleen Pratt, was something of a legend in business circles, a self-made woman who had built her empire from nothing, an orphan who had clawed her way to the top through sheer force of will. Hank had seen her photograph in the lobby, had heard the other guards talk about her in hushed, reverent tones. But he had never met her. He worked the night shift, and she was always gone by the time he arrived, or so he had thought. The floors of Preston Tower were quiet at night, the offices empty, the conference rooms dark. Hank walked his route with methodical precision, checking doors, testing locks, making notes in his logbook. He avoided the 15th floor. That was the medical wing, where the company kept its clinic and its first aid station. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of medical equipment, the sight of examination tables and IV stands, it all reminded him of things he had spent 5 years trying to forget. So he took the stairs past the 15th floor, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell, his eyes fixed straight ahead. It was nearly midnight when Hank heard the sound. A thud. Heavy. Final. Coming from the 30th floor, where the executive conference rooms lined a hallway of polished marble and frosted glass. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand reaching for the radio at his belt. The conference room door was open. The lights were on, and on the floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, lay a woman in a designer blazer with bruises crawling up her arms. Hank moved before his mind could catch up with his body. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees beside the woman, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. Her pulse was weak and irregular. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her eyes were closed, and her lips were parted. And for one terrible moment, Hank saw Marianne lying on the operating table, saw the monitors flatlining, saw his own hands covered in blood. He blinked, and the vision disappeared. This was not Marianne. This was someone else. Someone who needed his help. The executives in the room stood frozen, their faces masks of shock and confusion. One of them had his phone in his hand, fingers poised over the screen but unable to move. Hank ignored them all. He tilted the woman's head back, checking her airway. He lifted her eyelids and shone his flashlight into her pupils, watching for the telltale signs of neurological distress. Unequal dilation, sluggish response. The symptoms were familiar, too familiar. His hands moved with a precision he had not felt in 5 years, checking her pulse, her breathing, the bruises on her arms. These were not injuries from a fall. These were older, self-inflicted, the marks of someone who had been hurting themselves for a very long time. The woman's eyes fluttered open, green eyes, bright with pain and confusion, staring up at the stranger kneeling beside her. Hank felt something twist in his chest. Recognition. Not of her face, but of something deeper. The exhaustion in those eyes, the despair, the quiet resignation of someone who had given up on being saved. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the mirror every morning for 5 years. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. Hank leaned closer to hear her. She was asking him something, a question. He pulled back before she could finish, his hands trembling, his heart racing. The executives had finally sprung into action, one of them shouting into his phone, another rushing toward the door. Hank stood and stepped away from the woman on the floor. His job was done. He had stabilized her. He had kept her alive. Now the paramedics would come, and they would take over, and he could go back to being invisible. But as he turned to leave, the woman on the floor reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, barely more than a flutter of fingers against his skin. But it stopped him, held him. Her green eyes found his, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding. A recognition. She knew. Somehow, she knew. Hank pulled his hand free and walked out of the conference room without looking back. His shift was not over. His rounds were not complete. And he had a daughter waiting at home who needed her father to be strong. The next morning, Hank sat at the kitchen table and watched Rosie eat her breakfast. Pancakes today, with extra syrup, the way she liked them. She was telling him about a drawing she had made in art class, a picture of their family. Her, Hank, and Mommy, drawn in crayon with wings and a halo, watching over them from a cloud. Hank smiled and nodded and told her it was beautiful. But his mind was elsewhere. His mind was on the woman in the conference room, on her green eyes, on her bruised arms, on the way she had looked at him, as if she could see straight through his uniform to the man he had been before. The newspapers carried the story that afternoon. CEO Colleen Pratt had collapsed during a late-night meeting, the victim of exhaustion and overwork. She was resting comfortably at home. She would return to work within the week. There was no mention of the bruises, no mention of the security guard who had saved her life. Hank read the article twice, then folded the newspaper and threw it in the trash. It was better this way. Better to remain invisible. Better to remain forgotten. But Colleen Pratt had not forgotten. 3 nights later, Hank was making his rounds on the 30th floor when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find her standing in the hallway, pale and thin in a cashmere sweater that hung loose on her frame. She looked like a ghost. She looked like she had not slept in days. She looked at him with those green eyes, and Hank felt the ground shift beneath his feet. She thanked him for saving her life. Her voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a woman who was used to giving orders and being obeyed. But beneath the control, Hank heard something else, gratitude and curiosity. She asked him how he knew what to do, how he knew to check her pupils, how he knew to monitor her breathing. The questions of someone who had spent her whole life surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely surprised. Hank told her he had taken a first aid course. She smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knew she was being lied to. They talked for nearly an hour that night, standing in the empty hallway of the 30th floor. Colleen told him about her company, about the pressure of being CEO, about the investors who wanted more, and the board members who wanted different, and the employees who wanted better. She told him about the sleepless nights, and the skipped meals, and the headaches that had been getting worse for months. She did not tell him about the bruises. She did not tell him about the tumor. But Hank could see it in the way she held herself, in the slight tremor of her hands, in the way her eyes sometimes lost focus and drifted to somewhere far away. He had seen these symptoms before. He had seen them in Mary Ann. The conversations became a ritual. Every night, around midnight, Colleen would appear on the 30th floor, and she and Hank would talk. Sometimes about work, sometimes about life, sometimes about nothing at all. She brought him coffee once, expensive stuff from the executive lounge, and they drank it together in the darkness of the conference room where she had collapsed. The city sprawled beneath them like a constellation of earthbound stars, and in those quiet hours, the walls between them began to crumble. Hank told her about Rosie, about his daughter's drawings and her dreams, and her endless questions about the world. He told her about the pancakes he made every Sunday morning, shaped like animals, because Rosie insisted that round pancakes were boring. He told her about the bedtime stories he invented, tales of brave princesses who saved themselves and kind dragons who protected the innocent. Colleen listened with an intensity that surprised him. Her eyes never left his face when he spoke about his daughter, and sometimes he caught a flicker of something in her expression. Longing, perhaps. Or grief for a life she had never allowed herself to live. She had no family of her own, no children, no siblings, no parents. The company was all she had, and she had sacrificed everything to build it. But in those midnight hours, sharing coffee with the security guard who spoke about his daughter like she was the center of the universe, Colleen began to wonder if perhaps she had sacrificed too much. One night, Colleen asked Hank about his hands. They were sitting in the conference room, the city lights glittering through the windows, and she reached out and took his hand in hers. Her fingers traced the calluses on his palms, the rough skin, the old scars. These were not the hands of a security guard, she said. These were the hands of someone who had done delicate work, precise work, important work. Hank pulled his hand away and said nothing, but something had cracked open inside him, something he had kept locked away for 5 years. And for the first time since Mary Ann's death, he felt the urge to tell someone the truth. Colleen found out on her own. She was a CEO after all. She had resources. She had connections. She had a team of investigators who could find information about anyone. 2 weeks after her collapse, she called Hank into her office and confronted him with what she had learned. Dr. Henry Carver, chief of neurosurgery at Mercy General Hospital, one of the most promising surgeons of his generation. Until 5 years ago, when his wife died on his operating table, and he disappeared from the medical world entirely. Hank stood in her office and listened to her recite his history. He did not deny it. He did not explain it. He simply stood there, his huge hands hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Mary Ann that he kept in his wallet. Colleen asked him why he had given it all up, why he had walked away from everything he had built, why he had chosen to spend his nights opening doors for people who would never know his name. And Hank told her. He told her about Mary Ann, about the tumor, about the surgery that was supposed to save her life, about the moment when the monitors flatlined and his hands, his steady, precise, surgeon's hands, could not bring her back. He told her about the guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt of a man who had killed the woman he loved. He told her about the nightmares, about waking up in cold sweats, his hands still feeling the weight of the scalpel, his ears still hearing the sound of the flatline. He told her about Rosie, about the promise he had made to Mary Ann before she died. Take care of our daughter. Keep her safe. Give her a good life. And he had. He had given up everything to keep that promise, his career, his identity, his purpose. Because every time he looked at a patient, every time he held a scalpel, every time he stepped into an operating room, he saw Mary Ann lying on the table, and he felt his hands begin to shake. Colleen listened without interruption. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she told him her own secret, the headaches, the seizures, the tumor that had been growing in her brain for nearly 2 years. She had known about it since the beginning. She had chosen not to treat it. She had chosen to work herself to death. Because work was all she had, and dying slowly felt less frightening than living alone, The bruises on her arms were not accidents. They were punishments. Every time she felt weak, every time she felt afraid, she hurt herself to remind herself that she was still in control. Hank looked at this woman, this brilliant, broken woman who had built an empire and was letting it crush her. He saw himself in her eyes. He saw the same despair, the same resignation, the same quiet decision to stop fighting and let the darkness win. And something inside him shifted. Something that had been dead for 5 years began to stir. He told her she needed treatment. She told him it was too late. He told her there were surgeons who could help her. She told him she did not trust surgeons. She trusted him. Only him. The man who had saved her life in a conference room at midnight. The man who had seen her at her lowest and had not looked away. She wanted him to help her. She wanted him to save her. And Hank looked down at his hands, those huge, calloused, trembling hands, and felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on his chest. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Hank's life. He began researching Colleen's condition, pulling up medical journals on his phone during his breaks, calling old colleagues under assumed names to ask about treatment options. The tumor was operable, but the surgery was risky. Only a handful of surgeons in the country had the skill to attempt it, and one of them, 5 years ago, had been Hank Carver. Hank sat in his apartment at night, Rosie asleep in the next room, and stared at his hands. Could he do it? Could he step back into an operating room? Could he hold a scalpel again without seeing Mary Ann's face? The questions haunted him. The answers would not come. Rosie noticed the change in her father. She was 7 years old, but she had her mother's intuition. She asked him why he was sad. She asked him why he stayed up so late reading on his phone. She asked him about the lady at his work, the one he sometimes talked about when he thought she was not listening. Hank pulled his daughter onto his lap and held her close. He told her that Daddy was trying to help someone. Someone who was very sick. Someone who needed his help. Rosie looked up at him with her mother's eyes and asked him a question that stopped his heart. Is she going to die like Mommy? Hank did not answer. He could not answer, because the truth was, he did not know. Colleen's condition was deteriorating. The headaches were more frequent. The seizures were more severe. The bruises on her arms had multiplied, a map of self-inflicted wounds that told the story of a woman at war with herself. She still came to work. She still ran her company. She still met Hank on the 30th floor at midnight, drinking coffee and talking about nothing and everything. But the light in her green eyes was fading, and Hank could see the end approaching, slow and inevitable, like a train coming down the tracks. The call came at 2:37 in the morning. Hank was making his rounds on the 20th floor when his radio crackled to life. Medical emergency. 30th floor. Executive office. He ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, taking the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He found Colleen on the floor of her office, unconscious, blood trickling from her nose. The tumor had hemorrhaged. She was dying. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They loaded Colleen onto a stretcher and rushed her to the elevator. Hank followed, his uniform soaked with sweat, his mind racing. At the hospital, the doctors delivered the news. Emergency surgery was required. The tumor had to be removed immediately. But the procedure was incredibly complex. The chief surgeon was hesitant. The risks were too high. The chances of success were too low. They needed someone with more experience, someone who had done this surgery before, someone who knew exactly how to navigate the delicate terrain of the human brain. Hank stood in the hospital corridor and felt the walls closing in around him. He knew what he had to do. He had known it for weeks, maybe longer. But knowing and doing were two different things. He thought about Mary Ann. He thought about her smile, her laugh, the way she used to hold his hand before he went into surgery. He thought about her last words, whispered in the moments before he put her under anesthesia. I believe in you. I have always believed in you." And he thought about Rosie, asleep at home with the neighbor watching over her, dreaming her innocent dreams, waiting for her father to come home. A hand tugged at his sleeve. Hank looked down and saw Rosie standing beside him, her eyes wide with fear, her face streaked with tears. The neighbor had brought her when she heard the news. Rosie had insisted on coming. She had demanded to see her father. She had refused to stay home, refused to wait, refused to do anything except be by his side. And now she stood in the fluorescent glare of the hospital corridor, looking up at him with Marianne's eyes, clutching a worn, stuffed elephant that had been her mother's gift on the day she was born. The elephant's name was Trunk, and Rosie carried him everywhere when she was scared. Seeing that elephant in his daughter's arms broke something in Hank that he had not known was still intact. He knelt down to her level, and Rosie threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest, her small body shaking with fear and confusion. She did not understand why they were at a hospital. She did not understand why Daddy looked so sad. She only knew that something was wrong, something was broken, and she needed her father to fix it the way he fixed everything else in her world. Rosie took his hand in both of hers. Her fingers were small against his palm, fragile and warm and alive. She looked up at him and spoke, and her voice was steady, and her words were the words of a 7-year-old girl who understood more than any child should. "Mommy told me something before she went to sleep. She told me that your hands were made to save people. She told me that she was proud of you. She told me that she did not want you to stop helping people because of her. She wanted you to keep going. She wanted you to be brave." Hank knelt down and pulled his daughter into his arms. He held her tight against his chest and felt the tears streaming down his face. For 5 years, he had blamed himself. For 5 years, he had believed that his hands were cursed, that they brought death instead of life, that they had failed the one person who mattered most. But Marianne had never blamed him. Marianne had believed in him until her last breath. And now, standing in this hospital corridor with his daughter in his arms, Hank finally understood what she had been trying to tell him. His hands were not instruments of death. They were instruments of healing, and it was time to use them again. He walked into the chief surgeon's office and introduced himself, Dr. Henry Carver, former chief of neurosurgery at Mercy General. He had performed this exact surgery 17 times during his career, 12 successes, 5 failures. He knew the risks. He knew the complications. He knew every millimeter of the procedure by heart, and he was offering to help, not as the lead surgeon, but as a consultant. His hands had been away from the operating room for too long, but his knowledge remained, his experience remained, and if they would let him, he would guide them through every step of the surgery. The chief surgeon agreed. There was no time for background checks, no time for credentials, no time for anything except action. Hank scrubbed in and entered the operating room for the first time in 5 years. The smell of antiseptic hit him like a wave, triggering memories he had spent years trying to suppress. But he pushed through. He stood beside the operating table and looked down at Colleen's pale face, her eyes closed, her breathing steady under anesthesia. And he began to speak. 8 hours. 8 hours of tension, of precision, of life and death balanced on the edge of a scalpel. Hank did not hold the knife, but his voice guided every cut, every suture, every delicate maneuver through the labyrinth of Colleen's brain. His huge hands pointed at the monitors, traced pathways on the imaging screens, demonstrated techniques he had learned over decades of practice. There were moments when the room held its breath, when the monitors beeped warnings, and the surgeons paused with instruments suspended in midair. In those moments, Hank's voice remained steady, calm, certain. He had walked this path before. He knew where the dangers lay. He knew how to navigate around them. And slowly, methodically, with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing meant failing, he guided the team through the surgery. The tumor was larger than the scans had shown, The blood vessels were more tangled than expected. But inch by inch, millimeter by millimeter, they made progress. The surgical team moved in perfect synchronization, their instruments extensions of Hank's will, their movements dictated by his expertise. And when it was over, when the tumor had been removed and the bleeding had been stopped and Colleen's vital signs had stabilized, the chief surgeon looked at Hank with something like awe. They had done it. Against all odds, they had done it. Hank stepped back from the table and looked down at his hands. They were not shaking. For the first time in 5 years, they were not shaking. He walked out of the operating room and into the corridor, where Rosie sat, waiting with a coloring book and a box of crayons. She looked up at him with hope in her eyes, the same hope that Marianne used to have, and asked the question that he had been dreading for hours. Hank knelt down beside his daughter and took her hands in his. He told her the truth. Colleen was going to be okay. The surgery was a success, and Daddy had helped to save her. Rosie threw her arms around his neck and held him tight. Hank closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of her hair, the familiar smell of childhood and innocence and love. He whispered a promise to the photograph in his wallet, the photograph of Marianne that he carried with him everywhere. I did it. I finally did it. I am ready to live again. Colleen woke up 3 days later. The first thing she saw was a vase of flowers on her bedside table, bright yellow daisies that seemed to glow in the morning light. The second thing she saw was Hank Carver, sitting in a chair beside her bed, his huge hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. He looked exhausted. He looked relieved. He looked like a man who had just climbed out of a very deep hole and was seeing the sun for the first time in years. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was stronger than before, stronger than it had been on the night she collapsed in the conference room. She thanked him, not just for saving her life, but for giving her a reason to want to live it, for showing her that strength did not mean suffering alone, for proving that asking for help was not weakness, but courage. Hank squeezed her hand and smiled. It was not a big smile. It was not a perfect smile. But it was real, and it was warm, and it was the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in 5 years. 1 year later, Hank Carver stood in front of a classroom at Mercy General Hospital, not as a surgeon, but as a teacher. He had returned to the medical world, not to operate, but to train the next generation of neurosurgeons. His hands held a marker instead of a scalpel, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard, explaining techniques that he had perfected over decades of practice. The students watched with rapt attention, scribbling notes, asking questions, hanging on his every word. And when the lecture was over, Hank packed up his materials and walked out into the afternoon sun. Rosie was waiting for him in the parking lot, sitting on a bench with a backpack full of homework and a smile full of mischief. She was 8 years old now, taller than before, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that bounced when she walked. She ran to meet him, and Hank scooped her up in his arms and spun her around until she laughed. The photograph of Marianne still hung in their apartment, still watched over them from her place on the wall. But now there were other photographs beside it. Photographs of Rosie's birthday parties, photographs of family dinners, photographs of a life that was being rebuilt, one day at a time. Colleen came for dinner every Sunday. She had stepped back from her position as CEO, delegating more responsibilities, taking time to heal and to live. The bruises on her arms had faded, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who had finally learned to be kind to herself. The desperation in her eyes had been replaced by something softer, something that looked almost like peace. She brought wine and dessert and stories from her week, and she sat at the table with Hank and Rosie and laughed at jokes and argued about movies and felt, for the first time in her life, like she belonged somewhere. Sometimes she helped Rosie with her homework. Sometimes she taught the little girl how to play chess, a game she had mastered during lonely nights in boarding school. And sometimes When the evening grew late and Rosie had fallen asleep on the couch, Colleen and Hank would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights through the window, grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. They were not lovers. They were something rarer. They were two broken people who had helped each other become whole again, bound not by romance, but by something deeper. Understanding. Acceptance. The quiet recognition that they had seen each other at their worst and had chosen to stay anyway. One evening, as the dishes were being cleared and Rosie was getting ready for bed, the little girl asked her father a question. "Daddy, why are your hands so big?" Hank looked down at his hands. They were different now. Not calloused from security work, but not soft either. They were hands that had learned to heal again, hands that had found their purpose, hands that had been through darkness and emerged into light. He pulled his daughter onto his lap and held her close, and he gave her the only answer that mattered. These hands are big, so they can hold you tight, so they can keep you safe, so they can help the people who need to be helped. Your mother gave me these hands. She taught me how to use them, and as long as I have them, I will never stop trying to make her proud. Rosie smiled and kissed his cheek and ran off to brush her teeth. Hank sat at the table for a long moment, looking at the photographs on the wall. Mary Ann, Rosie, Colleen. 3 women who had changed his life in different ways. One who had taught him to love, one who had taught him to live, and one who had taught him that it was never too late to begin again. Outside the window, the city lights glittered in the darkness. Somewhere out there, people were hurting. People were struggling. People were giving up on themselves and on each other. But Hank Carver was no longer one of them. He had been broken, and he had been lost, and he had been afraid. But he had also been brave. He had reached out his huge, trembling hands and grabbed hold of something worth fighting for. And in doing so, he had saved not just 1 life, but 3. The photograph of Mary Ann seemed to smile at him from the wall. Hank smiled back. Then he stood up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to tuck his daughter into bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new opportunities to fail or to succeed. But whatever came, he would face it. He would face it with these hands, these huge, healing, hopeful hands that had finally learned to let go of the past and reach for the future. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, in the space between heartbeats, Mary Ann whispered her approval. "Well done, my love. Well done."